Hi, Steam Club friends, it's Miss Kathy. Have you ever wondered about why a balloon floats up in the air? It's because helium, the gas that is inside a balloon, is less dense than air. What do I mean by density? Density is the number of molecules and how close together they are. So helium is a gas where the molecules are really far apart. So that means there's fewer molecules inside the balloon than if you just blew it up with air from your lungs. So because there's fewer molecules inside that balloon, it's lighter. It doesn't weigh as much as the air, and it rises up. And if you let go of the string, it'll keep going until it's up higher than the air. Because that's what the helium wants to do. It wants to raise up above the air. Or have you ever been to the beach and you walk down wet sand versus dry sand? What happens? Right? When you're walking on the dry sand, your feet kind of sink into the sand. But when you're walking on the wet sand, your feet don't sink in as much. That's because the wet sand is a combination of sand and water, and it's denser, it's more compact than the dry sand, and it's harder for your feet to sink in. So we're going to do some experiments today on density. That's how compact the molecules are in a particular substance. Our first experiment, you're going to need 2 glasses of water, some salt, 2 eggs, a measuring spoon, 1 tablespoon, and a spoon to stir with. You're going to start with the first glass, and you're just going to leave it the way it is. With the second glass, you're going to add 3 tablespoons of salt. 1, 2, 3. And then you're going to stir it all up. Now there were pretty much equal amounts of water in both cups. Now the only difference is this one now has salt in it. In the next step, we're going to take our eggs. The one with just water, what's going to happen to our egg? What's your prediction? Let's find out. The egg is heavier than the water, so it falls to the bottom of the glass. What's going to happen when we put the egg into the glass with the salt water? Is it still going to sink? Let's find out. Now it's hard to see because all the salt hasn't dissolved completely, so the water's a little cloudy. But the egg, can you see it? It's pretty much floating on the top of the water. Why is that? Because the salt water is now a combination of water and salt. There's more molecules in the same amount of space, and so those molecules will help raise the egg up because the egg is now lighter than the salt water. Pretty cool, huh? All right, friends, are you ready for our next experiment with density? For this experiment, you will need an empty jar with the label off, filled about 2/3 of the way with water, and our other liquid is cooking oil. You'll also need some salt, and completely optional but kind of fun, some food coloring. I'm going to add a little bit of green food coloring to my jar. Then I am going to add, about 1 inch or so of cooking oil. Now, which one is heavier, the water or the oil? Will the oil drop down to the bottom of the jar and raise up the water? Or will the water stay on the bottom and the oil be on top? Or will they mix together? Let's find out. So it turns out that the oil has a lighter density. It doesn't weigh as much. It's not as heavy as the water. So the oil floats on top of the water. Next, you're going to take your salt and you're going to add some salt. Now, in our last experiment, we saw that the salt dissolved in the water. Will the salt dissolve in the oil the same way? It doesn't look like the salt dissolves in the oil. It sort of floats on top of the oil until it gets heavy enough, and the little blobs of the salt drop down to the bottom, and once they're on the bottom, then they will dissolve in the water. But when they drop down, they take a little bit of oil with them, and so you get these little blobs going. And it's kind of fun to watch, almost like a little lava lamp. There it goes. And once the salt dissolves off of the oil floats back up to the top because that's where the oil likes to be. So now we have the oil on the top, the water, and then down here we have little blobs of oil mixed with salt until the salt dissolves, and oops, there it goes, a little blob of oil just floated back to the top. And that's because oil has a lighter density than water. The salt drags it down. When the salt dissolves, the oil jumps back to the top of the jar. For our next experiment, we are going to build a density tower to see how dense various liquids are. We're going to start with some honey. And we're going to squeeze, about half an inch or so into our cup. All right, you want to be able to see your honey layer. I can see my honey. And then we're going to add some dish soap. So we have a nice pink layer on top of our yellow honey layer. Then we're going to add some water, and I added a little bit of blue food coloring just to make it easier to see, but you don't have to add the food coloring. All right, so now we have 3 layers, a yellow layer for the honey, the pink layer for the dish soap, and the blue water. Our next layer is oil. We know from our last experiment that the oil will float on top of the water. And then lastly, we're going to add a little rubbing alcohol. And I added some food coloring to the rubbing alcohol just again to make it a little bit easier to see. All right, so now we have 5 layers: honey, dish soap, water, oil, and rubbing alcohol. Right? And you can see that all the layers are pretty much staying separate because they have different densities. And then for the next part of the experiment, I grabbed some various small things that I could find around my house to see how they stacked up in density. So I've got a marble. I'm going to drop that in. And then marble is pretty heavy, so it went all the way to the bottom. I've got a cherry tomato. Now it's hard to see, but the cherry tomato stopped at the dish soap. It didn't go all the way down into the honey. What about a jelly bean? How far down will that go? Oh, jelly bean's heavy. It went pretty much to the bottom. How about a Lego? The Lego stopped at the oil level, so it didn't go anywhere close to the bottom. How about a little ball of Play-Doh? Play-Doh, surprisingly, went all the way down to the honey level. So find some small objects in your house, see how dense they are compared to the liquids and whether they will float or sink. How about a raisin? Raisin stopped at the oil level too. All right, so have fun, give it a try. For our last experiment, you're going to need a jar with a lid filled with about a third of the way up with water. You're going to need a little bit of cooking oil, and you're going to need some rubbing alcohol. You're going to take a little bit of food coloring and a drop or two in your water. Stir it up. All right, makes a pretty blue or whatever color you want. Then we're going to take a little bit of cooking oil, and we're going to use our pipette. And we're going to suck it up in our pipette. And we're going to put a little blob on the top of our water. All right? And so we know from our other experiments that oil is less dense than water, and so it will float on the top of the water. Then we're going to slowly add a little bit of rubbing alcohol. You might need to get a grown-up to help you with this, because we're going to tip the jar a little bit so that the alcohol runs down the side of the jar. And what should happen is, because the alcohol and the water have similar densities, they kind of mix together. And now, instead of a little flat blob of oil on top of the water, you have a little round ball of oil floating kind of in the middle of the water. Right? So you can experiment with this. Does it make a difference if you add more water or less water, more rubbing alcohol, less rubbing alcohol? What if I use just a little tiny drop of oil? Does that make a difference about where it floats? Mine is floating pretty high up. It's hard to see, but there's a little ball of oil floating underneath the surface. It's not on the surface anymore. So try this different ways, see what you think, and then you can close the lid and watch your oil bubble. Put it in the windowsill, let the light shine through it. It looks kind of cool. Have some fun, and we'll see you next time.